the last of the main presentations. This one is going to be delivered by Justin Sands, our guest from South Africa, University of Potchefstroom. Northwest University, okay, Northwest University. And the presentation is entitled After Onto-Theology, What Lies Beyond the End of Everything. Exciting title, and I'm sure the presentation will be not less exciting. So, Justin, floor is yours.
First off, I want to say thank you to the center and thank you to Martin. I've been following what you've been doing through Facebook, through your YouTube videos. I remain very impressed. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm glad we finally got this to work out, and so good for that. The title is from a article that I've already written, and I've condensed it down here. One of the things that sort of made me want to write this is that I keep browsing all the titles, and you see like the end of philosophy, the end of theology, the end of metaphysics, the end of transcendence, and stuff of that. And so I was wondering if this onto-theological problem might just be inevitable, and that this end of things could be something that we can move past and move beyond. So I've condensed the article. I'll give you a little preamble first, and then I'll get to what I actually want to unpack and discuss today. In a forthcoming article, I propose that perhaps onto-theology is inevitable in the constitution of our worldhood. I set my case by first reviewing the work of Jean-Luc Nancy and, collectively, Richard Kearney, John Caputo, and Merold Westphal. The former represents a transimmanent approach to post-metaphysically reconceiving the worldhood of the world, and the latter three represent various styles of appropriating metaphysical concepts into a phenomenological framework to otherwise overcome onto-theology's guilty charge. I concluded that after onto-theology, philosophy must turn further into theology to better understand human fallibility. The initial turn explored the fundamental theological conceptions of God and existence, a theological review of ontology and onto-theology, if you will. But this second turn explores how the Christian metaphysical tradition accepts its fallible nature, perhaps through original sin, proceeding nonetheless in an eschatological hope that discipleship and worship can lead to a better understanding of oneself, of others, and ultimately of God and creation. My goal was to find what may be hermeneutically and phenomenologically valuable to a philosophical description about the self and its world after accepting that any philosophical account will be just as fallible as what it seeks to describe. Thinking is always already hermeneutically and politically crossed. It cannot therefore stand above or beyond its own context. This is fairly obvious, especially after Gadamer, but it is often forgotten when addressing onto-theology because of a sort of naivete that one can escape or overcome metaphysics. Through Jean-Luc Nancy, I found that his refusal to accept essences throughout his deconstruction ultimately fails to allow the self to build up experiences. Everything is always already new again, or, at least without essences, one ignores what came before it. Subsequently, his deconstruction of Christianity, or auto-deconstruction of Christianity, attempts to stand outside of the Christian tradition and metaphysical tradition also, yet never can quite do so, since he is always already within a pervasive Christian context, no matter how secular Nancy wants it to be. And remember, secular also implies a Christian in a way. This is also seen in various Western atheisms which tend to keep Christian morality, its metaphysics sometimes, as a forgotten ground. Thus, their atheism often implies a Christian ethos. I found that Kearney's God of possibility and Caputo's insistence of God ignores the historical reality of experiencing God. For Kearney, if the God who may be allows one to experience the impossible made possible, then this becomes a lived event and hence a historical fact. Caputo's religion without religion seeks to uncover the event of God and its messianic insistence that is heretofore concealed in the name of God. However, his without is always haunted by the with and its latent metaphysical claims. For instance, his desire to uncover a faith without the belief of religion begins to resemble the same metaphysical hierarchy as one who seeks to find this pure faith that ultimately cannot become purely pure. Through Westphal, though Westphal accepts the nature of being in default and seeks an ethical self-transcendence to experience God's transcendence, his approach necessarily becomes confessional in order to do so. In short, he is right to link faith and works in his self-transcendence, but his efforts become less a phenomenological description and more a theological prescription. He goes too far in accepting the empirical nature of ontology by moving toward directing how that nature should be lived. This is not particularly disqualifying, but phenomenologically becomes an issue when one seeks only a descriptive understanding of the self and or contemporary religious life. My conclusion rested upon Schrijvers' proposal that we accept onto-theology's inevitability, and thus explore how this being a default unfolds within the religious life. He founds his phenomenology upon exploring how the self's expression of love within the world represents a love that knows it is lacking, but can nonetheless be shared. He then proposes that we go through the metaphysical tradition to find moments when this love breaks open our metaphysics to allow new presences of love, what I call moments of onto-theological relief. I solidify this claim through Colby Dickinson, who accepts a weak messianism that emerges through canons, orthodoxies, and other traditions rather than outside of them. It is with these two structures, a phenomenology that explores worldly love in order to find a better love, and a concept of messianism that breaks open the tradition for a new love to emerge, that I argue for a further theological turn. So, for my present presentation, this leaves me with 4 presuppositions, and then I'll get to the heart of the matter. I speak from within the Western Christian metaphysical context. Its ontology is necessarily linked to its empirical reality. This linkage reveals onto-theology's inevitability. And finally, in order to philosophize after this inevitability, one must go through the tradition, neither around it nor above it. So I know that was a lot, but I needed to sort of present that before I get to what I want to talk about. In what follows, I would like to unpack how Joeri Schrijvers and Colby Dickinson lay out this framework, which I find is the article's most valuable contribution. Therefore, what follows will presume the above in order to discuss where philosophy, particularly phenomenology, is heading and why. I will clarify any presuppositional statements in the forthcoming discussion if you have them. So, Schrijvers begins by arguing the significance behind Nancy and Caputo's, amongst others, failure to conceive a phenomenology that is at once post-metaphysical, i.e. non-onto-theological, and beyond Christianity or religion proper, as religion more often than not embodies a metaphysical posture. I will begin by looking at his conclusions to these exercises and how he builds off of them. Ultimately, Schrijvers finds that Nancy lacks a phenomenology of language. From this account, Schrijvers makes his case that ontology must have an empirical component. And I quote here, "If one follows Levinas's conclusion that saying or the address of the other occurs always and already in and from out of the said or that which is being addressed, then one cannot not conclude that Nancy's thought of the creation of the world forgets that even the speaking of the world happens from out of a determinate, definite world, culture, or being with one of another." End quote. Since Nancy's attempt to eclipse essence becomes impossible, then one begins to see that his attempt to deconstruct Christianity, speaking of it as if already outside of it, to have surpassed and overcome it, to dwell beyond its essence, seems to lack the means to confront the relics of this culture. Or, Nancy cannot perform this fundamental maneuver of deconstructing Christianity from the outside. His deconstruction of Christianity eventually resembles what he is deconstructing, since the essence of Christianity always remains within his efforts. Nancy's deconstruction only brings about more Christianity, albeit a slightly different version. Just like the post and postmodernism implies the modern, so too do contemporary atheisms or post-Christian frameworks imply a sort of Christianity that they are refuting. As argued below through Dickinson, this furthers the notion that a messianism which breaks open our onto-theological structures is always already located within the canonic, orthodox, and metaphysical tradition. Schrijvers is basically arguing that one cannot simply go around or beyond Christianity or metaphysics to arrive at the end, the true end of metaphysics. Nancy partially addresses this in his conception of Christianity being auto-deconstructive, but what comes after Christianity and its metaphysics will still always already be imprinted by Christianity and its metaphysics. And so I quote Schrijvers here at length. "If we are to avoid the illusions of overcoming it all, the deconstruction of Christianity and metaphysics to come must account for the eternal return of a certain metaphysics, and that which, amid a culture that is marked and stamped by metaphysics and Christianity, might forge positions and postures beyond outworn metaphysics. If the adjustments to metaphysics do not suffice to remedy the problem that metaphysics poses, to such an extent that metaphysics seems maladapted to contemporary times, then the time has come to comport oneself properly to the remains of metaphysics and of a certain strand of Christianity as well. This is what Heidegger had in mind when stating that metaphysics will not remain a choice. It is acknowledged, or can be acknowledged, that we still cannot think non-metaphysically, nor do we already live in a non-Christian culture, end quote. In sum, rather than going beyond or around the tradition, we should take the long detour through the tradition. Here, one may encounter moments of onto-theological relief, as I call it, which can help evolve the tradition rather than spark a revolution that replicates what it wishes to overturn. Importantly, Schrijvers' proposal does not see an overcoming of onto-theology, but an acceptance of its reality. Moreover, since the tradition is laden with attempts at ontologically understanding life in the mode of the everyday, he is also arguing for why the empirical realities of life matter to phenomenology. Life is not lived in a vacuum and can never be thoroughly understood as one. Pastors need to smell the sheep on them, and philosophers need to get their hands dirty, or at least know that no one's hands are clean. Or, more technically, if one cannot quite escape onto-theology when one's description of the world enters the world, meaning is employed by a person in understanding the world around them, then one might find the traditions grappling with this issue valuable. Schrijvers solidifies this foundation through his exploration of Caputo's Religion Without Religion, where his primary critique amounts to the idea that Caputo's without is more haunted by the with of religion than it may wish to be. Though Caputo recognizes this, what he does not accept is that perhaps Derrida, his primary influence, and I quote again Schrijvers at length, Derrida would cling to the essential contamination or pervertibility of faith. In this way, the secret that incites and ignites faith would be that there is no secret to this faith, and that it is at least never as pure as Caputo surmises. It is not without belief or beliefs. Rather, one could contend that there is no such thing as a pure faith, and that a faith, if there is any such a thing, elides the hierarchies of purer and purest faiths. Caputo forgets the tragic feel of deconstruction. The cut that is deconstruction is directed not against strong theology, against metaphysics and a stabilized destiny, but also against those who claim, hubristically, to be forever outside of onto-theology and metaphysics, and would so attain a purity of disinteresty. End quote. In search of a more pure faith, a search for the event of faith rather than its name, be it God or whatever else, Caputo's quest for an anti-metaphysical faith begins to resemble metaphysics by erecting hierarchies in order to become a more pure, less religious faith. The question of a strong or weak theology maintains an essential core of becoming more or less strong or weak, depending on either how far one enters into religion or seeks its uncovering, the latter of which still requires religious beliefs to deconstruct to find its purity. Schrijvers gives the following example. Derrida's earliest remembrance of the word God came when his mother thanked God for that Derrida's fever broke when he was a child. For Schrijvers, this reveals how, and I quote here, nothing is more common or natural than the human being trying to alleviate or otherwise explain away his or her being cut off from the truth, end quote. This prayer, in effect, attempts to bridge the gap between reality and truth, which comes more easily for the onto-theologian. Derrida's mother feels her powerlessness from not knowing the fever's cause or its remedy. Once it broke, for whatever reason, she sought a concluding answer. Thank God it broke. Thank God or whoever or whatever made it break. What this story shows, and what Caputo misses, is that Derrida's description of prayer reveals faith's empirical reality. Yes, this wishful, thankful prayer might corrupt a purer faith, but it also reveals that the effects of faith matter just as much as seeking a more originary faith, perhaps even more so. And again, a lengthy quote, I apologize. Nothing in Derrida prevents us from focusing on exactly the end of prayer, where certain onto-theological instrumentalization of the divine comes naturally to us. Derrida would not then be describing the origin of faith, but rather the experience of one who is always and already losing his faith, who suffers from always and already having lost his faith, or only has faith in a very unfaithful way, end quote. And impure faith, then, helps us locate where onto-theology becomes lodged within one's understanding of being in the world, perhaps between one's faith and the beliefs gathered in the name of that faith. Schrijvers eventually develops this notion through Derrida's concept of bad consciousness. But what matters for us is that this unveiling of an impure faith as the consequence of onto-theology convinces Schrijvers that, and I quote again, the human being, I suggest, is in default, like one can be in default when one fails to pay back a loan. Being in default here is crucial. Our failed attempts at evading or overcoming onto-theology reveal a lack within the human condition, a lack so well exemplified by the onto-theological problem, I find. For some, particularly theological readers, this may be nothing new and resonates with the doctrine of original sin. But philosophy cannot presuppose the fall, yet can nonetheless recognize human nature's frailty and fallibility. Hence, onto-theology becomes not a problem to overcome. It is the problem that helps us locate the frailty and fallibility of human nature within human reason itself. If the onto-theological condition can be seen in the impure faith as the between of faith and belief, where faith becomes corrupted by its contents, and this inevitability uncovers our default position, then there might be a way of addressing it. Being in default, we can only progress through by humbly accepting that it is always and forever our condition. We will always have a lack within our reasoning, exemplified in our actions. This latter part is likewise crucial, since as we have seen through both Nancy and Caputo, we need to accept the empirical implications of ontology, or perhaps ontology's empirical nature, if we're ever going to craft a phenomenology after onto-theology. Schrijvers finds within Binswanger's reading of Heidegger a blueprint to craft such a phenomenology. Now, we do not have the time or space to completely detail Schrijvers' lengthy account of Binswanger, and one may not need to find Binswanger convincing to agree with Schrijvers' overall point. Therefore, I will briefly review Schrijvers' use of Binswanger to progress after onto-theology, and how this requires him to find a phenomenological link between an ontological understanding of the world with an empirical count of the world. Binswanger emphasizes a love which ends where care begins, namely in the thinking of my singular being, of an ego which, despite love, knows of a Sehnsucht and longing that remain even after being with its ontic you in love. This stress on love after Heideggerian care has an ontological aim that reveals that there is more going on between two lovers than just appreciation, or the capacity to love, which is seen in care. Love, and I quote here, love is erected as the fundamental condition of possibility of knowledge, stemming from the recognition that love itself aspires to the idea in its Platonic sense, and transcends the very ontic figures and way with which we love, and sometimes love badly, end quote. Thus, the ontological claim within Binswanger's analysis wagers that understanding the human being requires one to love the human being, but to love the human being, one must be with the human being within the world, know of the nullity of care, and put its negativity to work. Or, to understand the primordial relation between Dasein, one has to account for the conversation that humanity has with itself throughout the various epochs of thought. Binswanger's epistemological claim thus unfolds as love itself unfolds. First the world, then love, and finally a return to the world. Here, one can see that Binswanger's phenomenology reveals the importance of embodiment to ontology, and thus how that embodiment acquires meaning for itself and for others and for the world. Love, then, becomes an essential characteristic in which this embodiment can be known and understood. Binswanger links ontology to its empirical reality through the self's embodiment, and, through embodiment, that which the self loves. Love's finite temporality holds a transcendent character, given that love can pass beyond a couple's companionship, beyond death even. Aside from loving another who has passed, Binswanger also emphasizes this in his account of art and literature, which adds a layer of compassion to the concept of love. Love is not just for lovers, but for those whose expression of passion finds a welcoming or appreciation in others. Accordingly, Schrijvers claims that a phenomenology of love holds something like an ontology incarnate, since it emphasizes that for one to understand the being of the self and of other selves, it must turn into the world, and then to what one loves in the world, and finally back to the question of being itself. Traced through the very ontic you whom I love, back to being, to who I am. Importantly, this ontology incarnate is a thoroughly secular description. Even though it can be used in a theological manner, its emphasis on love provides a framework for various accounts of this something more one experiences in life. The essences of love, Schrijvers concludes, lies in its existence. Through acceptance, this phenomenology is fundamentally open to all forms of love, but in and of itself, it does not proclaim what love is nor can be. It rather focuses on what the experience and expression of love shows itself to be, deconstructing these forms in order to seek a better understanding of love. It is here that Binswanger gives us a way to proceed after onto-theology. Through its description of an ontology incarnate that loves what it loves, it links the what is through what it does, or better still, what it does for what it loves. Henceforward, phenomenology can deconstruct and describe these acts of love and what they reveal, taking into account their empirical and onto-theological character of being in default or fallible. And it also can describe pathways to better expressions of love. Onto-theology finds its place here. Being in default means that one knows that there are other ways to love, that there might be a better way to love. Following Samuel Beckett, I quote here, "Ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better." Or, if I may, try again, love better. Through Schrijvers' phenomenology, I see a way to return to the Christian and metaphysical tradition for a better understanding of what comes after onto-theology. One cannot stand outside the tradition, nor is there any possibility of a pure faith, but one can find within the tradition moments of onto-theological relief, where love's expression, religious or otherwise, breaks open metaphysical structures. Here, Schrijvers sees love not as a possibility, but as an incarnate and historical event. The two or more lovers, gathered in whomever's name, actually express a love that is always already hermeneutically crossed in its historical facticity. Binswanger convinces Schrijvers that a phenomenology of love no longer takes the detour through God, but remains with the detour through the world, where human beings dwell, meet, and actually love one another. Its secularity enables it to better understand the religious life of the self, rather than how the divine might enter into the self's life. This is an imperative pivot within philosophy of religion, since we can now embrace the natural lack or default within the self, and how what we share is not so much our capacity for love, but rather our lack of love. Going through the metaphysical tradition, then, is an acceptance of this lack, and when one speaks of God while being in default, one shares this default and yearns for a better love with others who are a part of that tradition. The moments when we find a better love within that tradition, either as onto-theological relief or as a revelation, the Holy Spirit perhaps, we also find moments where this lack seems more fulfilled, more opening, a shattering of love's expectations, to appropriate Rahner. This search requires a deeper return into theology then. Accordingly, we must deal with how one might follow this further turn after onto-theology, while remaining phenomenological and philosophical in orientation. Here, Colby Dickinson's Between the Canon and Messiah enters the discussion, where he focuses upon Giorgio Agamben and Jacques Derrida's debate regarding the violent nature of canons and the messianic forces that break them open. Dickinson essentially seeks a better understanding of the nature of canons and orthodoxy in relation to antinomianism and the messianic events that overturn these canons. On the one hand, orthodoxy necessarily binds a given community, where its canon solidifies what that community believes and, for our purposes, loves. On the other hand, a messianic force periodically breaks open this canon, which provides a reawakening through shattering the canon's orthodoxy, possibly opening new concepts of love within the community. If we're going to turn further into theology, then we need a strong sense of how we can find these moments of onto-theological relief without negating the metaphysical structures from which they spring. Dickinson's final conclusion that the messianic force can be in hermeneutical tension with the necessary and inevitable formation of the canon mirrors Schrijvers' phenomenology, while also showing us a way to approach the Christian and metaphysical tradition. The canon, for Dickinson, and I quote here, signifies a cultural symbolic reality, end quote, whereas the messianic represents a quasi-heretical impulse to break open orthodoxy. The canon's political force stems from its dialectical sifting of what is deemed legitimate for a given culture. Dickinson seeks a possible reconciliation between the canon and the messianic through putting the canon's dialectical structure into direct tension with its messianic opposition, thereby exposing it to new and plurivocal ideas. The revolution gets theologically suspended in the dialectic it wishes to topple, if you will. This further reveals a link between ontology and empirical reality, particularly concerning the canon's political nature within belief systems. This nature, Dickinson argues, can be understood as the religious desire to transcend all representations. Its messianic force is to be understood in relation to our formulations of shared sovereign power, or its canonical manifestation. Our personal beliefs contain a public dimension in representation, since they are shared and or mediated throughout culture, thus playing a part in the sovereignty given to society, or the political. The establishment of political sovereignty for any society is its approval of certain beliefs, which are legitimized and given authority through the establishment of canons. Hence, and I quote here, "A canon is only a force which determines how certain norms will become legible to the subjects who are in turn subjected to them." End quote. It's here that the canon's inherent violence arises. It necessarily rejects some ideas, and those who hold them often, while legitimating others. Therefore, any permanent interruption of these dynamics follows the same trajectory as the canon. The elimination of all canons excludes those who adhere to them, thus merely replacing one dialectical set for another. Here, one can also see the attempts at discarding the Christian and metaphysical tradition. More often than not, replicates that tradition in some form, often coalescing around the essential ideas that motivated people to discard that tradition in the first place. Contrary-wise to Caputo's weak messianism, Dickinson parallels, I'm almost done, don't worry. Dickinson parallels Schrijvers in seeing that one cannot have the messianic without its canonical counterpart. This question of whether one can eliminate canons without forming anti-canons is central to the debates between Derrida and Agamben. Skipping ahead for time, Dickinson eventually finds the tension between Derrida and Agamben almost irresolvable. What's important for our investigation is how this tension is used to accept the canon's inevitability and to understand that the messianic opening of the canon needs to come from within the canon itself, not from the outside. Thus, overturning the canon's violent and hegemonic nature from within itself maintains the best of the canon, which keeps the community alive and together. It becomes an evolution of the canon, not a revolution that replicates what it wishes to topple. This is crucial for us since it shows two things. First, how one might pass through the tradition while acknowledging onto-theology's place within that tradition, as well as one between the faith of the community and their professed beliefs. Second, how one can better understand that these messianic moments inevitably pass through a tradition and subsequently shape and form that tradition. Dickinson capitalizes upon Derrida's argument that the canon is a social inevitability, revealing how canons function as a binding of a community's sense of justice. Not only do these canons authorize what we see as culturally important, but, referring to their political force, they also symbolize what we see as justice, further increasing their violent and silencing nature. The canon, in the course of meting out justice, tends to absolutize its findings, enhancing its sovereignty and authority. Yet, this absolutization can only hold for so long, and as it tightens its grip upon sovereignty, it eventually breaks itself apart. This is where the messianic arises, but similar to the impossibility of a pure faith and the messianic moments that break open faith, Derrida's deconstruction comes within the canon itself, while recognizing that it can never actually destroy the canon. And here I quote again, "The spectral messianic forces that run throughout any canonical form will always disturb, though the canonical form will yet always persist." End quote. Consequently, deconstruction can only break down canons and texts in order to reveal and explore their messianic forces, thereby opening canonical justice to heretofore uncovered justices that have been silenced. From Agamben, Dickinson sees the necessity of recognizing the sovereign structures that legitimize the canon, which are reciprocally and simultaneously legitimized by the canon. Agamben attempts to seek what is behind all canons and texts in order to find the pre-linguistic origin before all inscription. Focusing upon the signification within our textual nature as our original sin, as he says, Agamben seeks a path to undo the political force that undergirds our entire system, canons, texts, contextualities. Deconstruction works within the system it wishes to reconstruct, and Agamben thus finds Derrida complicit in continuing its violence. Alternatively, I do have a little bit long. Do you mind if I keep going?
Well, I think you can finish it.
Okay, thanks. Alternatively, Agamben seeks an archaeological uncovering of these significations before the canon, and, once they are revealed, a coming community would no longer need its text codified or authorized for any theological aim toward justice. Furthermore, this community, not having an aim towards justice represented in canons, would not need political representation to support their narrative inscriptions. Justice is found in uncovering the forces behind canons and removing the transcendental barriers that stitch them together. Derrida critiques this as superficial and, one could say, lacking in spiritual depth. Removing canons and seeking the archaeological origins behind them makes one fall into a sort of archive fever, where the archaeologist who chooses which and what text to uncover becomes the sovereign. Derrida finds that Agamben's approach merely replaces one sovereign for another, but in a much more violent way, since the archaeologist alone controls what gets uncovered. This is similar to Schrijvers' argument against trying to go around the tradition. One cannot do so in the first place, and if one nonetheless tries, their findings merely replicate that tradition. Through Dickinson, we see that this debate is similar to the question where onto-theology emerges and how one might overcome it, thereby revealing the necessity of hermeneutics, and that the answers we have given to this question of onto-theology's inevitability say just as much about our philosophical views as they do about our political ones, a connection not always clear in our basic political formulations. That was a quote. The approach we take to onto-theology is already hermeneutically crossed by our own political situation and context. Accepting that the messianic emerges from within the canon recognizes this. If the messianic breaks open the canon, then it must be contextually related to that canon in some form. Moreover, following Derrida, creating a less violent canon can only come from a deconstructive critique of the canon itself. Yet still, exploring onto-theology, and perhaps trying to overcome it nonetheless, trying to think a thought that one cannot think, adds a creative measure to understanding the primordial constitution of canons, I find. Therefore, all those who have sought to an end of onto-theology, to metaphysics, to canons, to an end of everything, were not foolish to do so. Their efforts helped overturn the canon itself, tilling the soil to break it open, in order to at once allow future crops to grow and to allow us to better see what lays beneath. In conclusion, Schrijvers and Dickinson reveal how one might proceed after onto-theology, where onto-theology itself is always already empirical, political even, and thus one must go through metaphysics since one cannot understand the world without the history of that world. This recognition, remarkably, compels philosophy to accept its political and empirical characteristics, enable it to turn further into the political and empirical nature of theology as a dialogue partner. The Christian tradition readily accepts that one is in default while living in hope for a moment of revelation or an eschatological event of reconciliation. Here, philosophy can explore how this plays out in various theologies to understand what one does when accepting being in default and trying nonetheless to fail better. Just like with the canonic and the messianic, the desire to overcome onto-theology gets theologically suspended in accepting that one needs onto-theology to move forward in life and in understanding the worldhood of that life. Thank you.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. It was, well, a bit longer, but we still can allow ourselves 10 minutes more or something. So thank you very much. And now